Perhaps one of the greatest atrocities to have happened to Christianity is the domestication of the gospel message. The late Anglican Bishop N.T. Wright put it well, saying, "When St. Paul preached, there were riots. When I preach, they serve me tea." It's all too common nowadays to encounter a Christianity that is cute and nice, a feel-good message that allows us to remain comfortable and complacent. The most solemn feast of Easter that we celebrate today has been dumbed down to colored eggs and chocolate bunnies. The world's general opinion of the resurrection of Jesus is that it's a fabrication, an ancient myth that is supposed to be taken symbolically. As a myth, Jesus' resurrection ought to teach us how to be more spiritual and loving, even in the face of death. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I love myths. Good stories and myths tell us deep truths about human nature and the human person. Yet, as the British author C.S. Lewis once said, those who claim that the gospel stories are mythic simply haven't read many myths. C.S. Lewis was a professor of literature and knew the nature of myths pretty well. So what does he mean? You see, myths deal with archetypal abstractions, which is why myths take place in worlds set apart from our own. Think Once Upon a Time, or In the Land of Mordor Where Shadows Lie, or In a Galaxy Far, Far Away. Placing a story in a fictional world is characteristic of a myth. But when we look at the Gospels, we see a very different kind of story. We see real places, Nazareth, Galilee, and Jerusalem. We also encounter real historical people, like St. Peter and Pontias Pilate. The point is, the Gospels are so grounded in history that it separates itself entirely from the genre of mythic literature. Now, with all this in mind, you can begin to imagine how the real historical, undomesticated gospel message can cause chaos to the status quo. Tyrants don't tremble at a mythical interpretation of the resurrection account. But when taken literally, that God raised up the man who the Roman Empire executed, that's a message that will strike fear into any secular ruler. It's a message that is utterly revolutionary. If Jesus is risen from the dead, then all the powers of the world that are predicated upon hatred and violence have been conquered. The tyrannous grip of totalitarianism and of the universal powers of suffering and death has lost all of its potency. By Jesus' resurrection, God made a fool out of evil. This is why Paul can say, "I preach one thing, Christ and Christ crucified." Back in the first century, that would have struck Paul's listeners as absolutely absurd. Christ crucified? As in someone who underwent the most severe and humiliating state-sponsored execution known to man? Yes. Why? Because Jesus rendered that severe and humiliating state-sponsored execution powerless. As followers of this risen Jesus, it's our job to proclaim this earth-shattering truth. That's what we call evangelization. Now, to our modern ears, the word evangelization has become rather stale. Go out and evangelize, we say, and be sure to invite everyone over for coffee and donuts. True evangelization is anything but that. Again, go back to the first century. Evangelion, that's the Greek origin meaning good news. You know who sent evangelists around in the ancient world? It was Caesar. If he won a great victory, he would send evangelists out to proclaim that he was Lord, the mighty conqueror. Christians in the first century didn't use this term evangelion by accident. It was intentional. And as you can imagine, it was a slap in the face to every secular power that existed. The early martyrs of the church testify to that. But they believed it down to the very last drop of blood that they shed. No, Caesar does not bear the good news, nor does any pleasure or power that could be found on earth, because in the end, they all crumble under death. No, the real good news, the real evangelion, is someone who trampled death underfoot. The real good news is that by God's grace and mercy, this power to trample death has been handed over to each and every one of us. My brothers and sisters, what philosophers, poets, kings, and explorers only dared to dream of, we possess in full: immortality. And not only immortality, but an immortality imbued with divine life. An immortality that lets us live as gods, for we are brothers and sisters in Christ, and therefore sons and daughters of the eternal King. It was this truth that led Paul to proclaim, "O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Bold words, but absolutely true because of what we celebrate here today. The challenge for us now, in the 21st century, is not to take this history-altering event for granted. Again, Paul urges us to keep this truth of the resurrection ever before our eyes in the second reading. Think of what is above, he says, not of what is on earth. Or, as the Italian poet Dante once wrote, the heavens wheeling round call to you, revealing their eternal beauties. Yet you keep your eyes fixed on the ground alone, and he, the all-discerning, strikes you down. Strikes you down may be putting it lightly. God's only Son defeated the greatest enemy of mankind, death itself, and we walk around as if it doesn't matter. If you asked a room full of people what they are truly afraid of, I guarantee most of them would answer death. Death eats away at our hearts and looms over us like a storm cloud. And yet, the God-man we worship put death to death. And yet, we live our lives as if it doesn't matter. No, the resurrection is not a myth. And yes, this power to overcome death is ours to keep if we but follow Christ. Let us remember then that through the hope we hold in this Easter event, the end of our life stories will be full of happiness and joy. To give into despair because we all suffer death is to be blind to the light of the resurrection. The pain and sufferings in life we go through now will one day be remembered as a faint dream compared to the glorious life that is to come. In Jesus Christ, there are no tragedies, but only divine comedies.